Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Integrating Bioprotection or Biological Products in Greenhouse, Cannabis, and Hemp Markets, which is sponsored by Marrone Bioinnovations. I'm Robin Sittberg of Meister Media Worldwide, publisher of American Vegetable Grower magazine. In this webinar today, experts from Marrone Bioinnovations will talk about the BioUnite program, which provides a roadmap for using biological products in combination with traditional chemistries, which enhances the performance and sustainability of both. This webinar has been approved for 1 CEU credit from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, or CDPR, and for 1 half credit in Integrated Pest Management from CCA. To receive credit, you must watch the entire webinar. And your credits will be submitted within 2 weeks from today, the live air time, which is December 4th. We will have time for some questions and answers. We can take a few after our first speaker and the rest after the presentation. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to ask a question, just type it in the question pane at the lower left panel of your screen and click Submit. And you can do this at any time during the webinar. So we have 2 speakers today, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce them. Dr. Timothy Johnson is Vice President of Field Development and Technical Services at Marrone Bioinnovations. He has more than 30 years of experience in the development of biopesticides, including microbial insecticides, microbial and plant extract fungicides, and pheromones for insect monitoring and mating disruption. At Marrone, he's responsible for developing efficacy data worldwide. Our second speaker is Dr. Matthew Brecht, and he's widely renowned as a thought leader in the cannabis industry, and he has more than 20 years of experience in farming systems, plant pathology, crop protection, testing, epidemiology, crop management, and pest control strategies in ag production. Most recently, Dr. Brecht was the president and founder of Dutch Valley Farms, an indoor cannabis producer located in Portland, Oregon. So they have a lot of information to share, and I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Matthew Brecht.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone listening in on this webinar. Again, my name is Matt Brecht with Marrone Bioinnovations, and I'll be starting off giving a little brief company overview, and then we'll be getting right into one of the main topics that I'll be presenting today, which is cannabis and hemp integrated pest management and solutions. Just a little bit of a company overview. We were incorporated in June of 2006. We have currently 7 commercially available products or active ingredients. We do have about a little over 110 employees. About 1/3 is in R&D right now. But we have a huge library of proprietary microorganisms that we're continually screening as part of our research and development program, trying to bring new products to the market soon. And we have a couple that are extremely interesting that hopefully will be coming online in a year or 3. We ferment our own all our own products. We make our own products. That production is done in Bangor, Michigan. And yeah, we have commercial sales in North America, Latin America, Africa, and the Mideast. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go over a very brief overview, of the products and what they are and the category and what they do. So I don't want to go over too much because we'll be talking more about this later, but many of you have heard or seen some of these products. The first one is Regalia. It is a product of an extract of a giant knotweed, and what it does is it confers fungicide, disease resistance, and plant health. Stargus is a unique strain of Bacillus bacteria, also what we call a biofungicide. Grand Evo is a species of bacteria that we use as a bioinsecticide. Venerate is very much the same, it's just a different species of bacteria. Magistine is a species of bacteria that we're using to control feeding root nematodes. Haven is a coconut oil extract, which we're finding to show reduced sun and water stress in crop protection, and also increases yields and quality. And finally, something that we've acquired several months ago is we bought a company called Jet Harvest. And if many of you are familiar with peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide, this is one of those, and it's a 5% solution called Jet Ag. So we are using that as a broad disinfectant, both the foliar sprays, root drenches, but you can also, spray down walls and benches and whatnot. Okay, so a little about me. So this is a slide here. I have a couple of pictures on there. The top left one is a large grow operation in Los Angeles, indoor cannabis grow operation. The bottom two left slides are my operation in Oregon. And the bottom right picture is me in a hemp field in North Carolina. So all this year has been unprecedented with the amount of acreage of hemp going out. And we had a lot of successes and a lot of failures. And, hopefully you can glean some information from this webinar to have more success. So CBD hemp right now in the United States is being grown as transplants. There are some that are being direct seeded into the fields, but generally what you'll do is you're popping seeds in trays, or you're doing clones, which is more rare, but most people are popping seeds in trays, growing them up as a transplant in a greenhouse, and then transplanting them out in the field. And cannabis and hemp, if you look at the bottom two pictures, you really couldn't see if there are actually cannabis or hemp. It's basically a matter of testing the flower to see whether it has THC or does not have THC. And as most of you know, CBD hemp in the United States is qualified as anything under 0.3% THC. This is an interesting slide here, kind of just showing what the United States in 2018, when they passed the hemp bill, this map represents 2019 hemp farming. So 46 states agreed with it and said, hey, yeah, we're going to make it legal for any grower, as long as they register and get a license, they can grow hemp. And it's estimated that about 250,000 acres were grown in 2019 of CBD hemp. Some of the, if you can see some of the numbers there, sure.
Oh, excuse me, Matt. I just wanted to remind you, we were hoping to do a poll to ask readers what they grow. So
yes, sorry.
If this might be a good time to launch that.
Yeah, so we know we have a bunch of people online right now, and we're curious to see who's growing what. So there's a poll online if you can take it real fast. I believe it basically asks if you are growing cannabis or you're growing hemp or both, or vegetables and ornamentals in the greenhouse.
Yeah, it should just be a quick multiple choice question, and then in a few seconds, about 20 seconds, the results will appear on your screen, and you'll get to know the composition of our audience and what they're growing. Things are changing quite a bit.
Yes, they are. So why don't I just keep going, and as the results come in, we'll go from there?
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, very good. Yep, so just go back to the hemp right now in the United States and how it just kind of played out this year. Again, 250,000 acres was estimated to be grown in the United States. And it's not surprising that the West Coast has the majority of the large acreage because of our climate and our sort of long history of cannabis and hemp. And what was very surprising to see is the large acreage immediately going into the southeastern states, not unsurprising because of tobacco production. So many tobacco farmers were the key growers in the southeast for CBD hemp because they had very similar growing methods and equipment that can be used not only for tobacco, but they can also be used in hemp. And one of those things is they all have tobacco dryers, these big dryers that they can put hemp right into, and within 3 days dry that hemp down to be ready for sale. So just briefly go over for those who are new to cannabis and hemp. I kind of wanted to give you an overview of what we're talking about. There are three species. So it's Cannabis indica, Cannabis sativa, and Cannabis ruderalis. Most people know indica and sativa, and I won't go too much into that. Only that their origins are obviously different from where they are, where they were land races in the world, and how they grow. So an indica generally is much smaller, squatter plant, larger leaves, where a sativa is a much longer or taller plant, skinnier leaves, and typically the flowering length is an extra 2 to 5 weeks longer than an indica plant of the same grow. Now, the third one is called ruderalis, and ruderalis, Cannabis ruderalis, is a landrace found up in northern Russia and China, and because of the short day length of production, or basically the season of where it grows, it has to germinate, flower, or grow, then flower, and then continue with or finish its life cycle in a very short period of time. So ruderalis is now being used to what we refer to as autoflowers. So we're taking the genetics of ruderalis and putting it into the hybrids of indicas and sativas to make an autoflower or a non-photoperiodic plant. In other words, you don't necessarily have to have a long veg cycle and then flip it into flower, which it has to basically have a 12 to 12 light cycle, so 12 hours on, 12 hours off. With the autoflowers, you can directly plant it into your outside or in your greenhouse, and it will do its whole life cycle irregardless of how much light it's getting. Just to see what the differences are between male and female plants. So males in the CBD hemp and cannabis world really only come into play for breeding. So if you see any males that are out in your fields or in your grow operations, obviously that's not wanted. You should basically rogue those plants away because they're not going to be producing much of anything as far as commercial viability. So if you look very early on, you get these little pollen sacs that hang down, and further in the flower in the middle picture is a very long pollen that's now open and ready to pollinate a wide array around it. One plant can pollinate many thousands of square feet around it, so that's why you do not want to have males pollinating your females, because then it'll take energy away from producing CBD or THC and terpenes and putting it more into seeds, which is necessarily not wanted. This picture here is these couple pictures here are the female flower. So very early on, right as it's about to produce flower, you will see some of these hairs, these little white hairs, and a couple of bracts on the stem, and that is very indicative of a female plant, and that is obviously what we want. And as that plant matures, what you see is those stalks where the flowers are forming. We call them a cola. So on that flower, what we say is those flowers will grow, become dense, and fill in that cola. So what you see is mature flower on the very right-hand side, where it's one solid mass of flowers and small leaves that are containing all of the medicine and the terpenes involved. This is a picture, so just to give you a real idea of what we're looking at, where the medicine is. Maybe some of you guys aren't aware exactly what we're talking about, where the CBDs and the THCs and all these terpenes we talk about that we extract or that people are using for medicine. So if you look very closely in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see 1, 2, and 3. And these are different trichomes. And so the trichomes are where the THC, CBD, and so the terpenes reside. And so we call them bulbous, capitate sessile, or capitate stalked. And if you look at the overall picture of that little pistil right there, which is the formation, the flower form itself, you'll see that there's a word on top right that says trichomes, and you can see like little trichomes with these little glandular heads, these little round balls on top. Those round balls is where basically all of the medicine and the terpenes are. There is some in the epidermal layer to a lesser degree. But just for those who know, if you heard about concentrates, basically it is to remove just that material, the trichomes, from the flower, and that gets concentrated down to be a very high potent product that is free of organic matter. So some of the benefits of CBD include pain relief, anti-cancer, anti-anxiety, anti-seizure, antipsychotic, anti-inflammatory, muscle relaxants, and they're neuroprotective as well. And so we have all of these treatments that we can use CBD oil for. And in some respects, a lot of this can also be used with THC, with high THC product as well. But for now, hemp grown with CBD, this is what they're going after medically. So the next, the next bunch of slides here are going to be talking more about what are the diseases and insects that we generally see in cannabis and hemp. And so this gets to the heart of more of an integrated pest management program. And I list not only our products, but a lot of other products that are in general use right now to control these diseases and insects. So the first one we're talking about is Fusarium and Pythium. So any of those root rots. And I've lumped them together because this is basically a very early part of the vegetation period. Generally, right after transplant is when we'll see these diseases show up. And the bottom, the left-hand picture is mycelium of Fusarium. And so if you see some aerial Fusarium like this on plants, that generally is, this generally is producing basically spores that can infect the rest of your grow operation, and specifically your vegetation area. Once the flowers, or excuse me, once the plants mature and they're more into a flower state, it's very rare for Fusarium or Pythium to do any real damage. If you're in a hydroponic system, you may have more of a likely if you're not cleaning out your fertigation. The top right picture is commonly what we see. You may have heard of a term called damping off, or a root and stem rot is basically what this is. And both Pythium and Fusarium species can cause this. What we see, though, in an indoor situation with cannabis grown recreational or in the transplants for CBD is very early on. We'll see this specifically when soils are overwatered and not in a clean environment. So what kind of products will work on this? So Regalia as a drench, peracetic acids, products like Jet Ag or Xeritol and Oxidate. Micronized sulfur seems to work fine also. And then we have these microbial inoculums such as Bacillus species, Trichoderma, Streptomyces, things like that. And a product, if you're familiar with some of these products, an example would be TerraGrow or Root Shield as a kind of a soil inoculant to help prevent these diseases. And Bacillus species such as Stargus or Double Nickel or Armory do a good job as well. And a lot of people are also saying that compost teas can also have good reduction, let's say, in disease. So the next one we're going to talk about is one of the more infamous diseases out there for cannabis and hemp, and that's powdery mildew. And as you can see, the top right is the start of it. The bottom left, the bottom right, excuse me, picture is more of an advanced stage. And then if you ever get powdery mildew in late flower, that's a big no-no. And if you do get it in there, basically the biggest or the best product to use is a peracetic acid, because it'll have direct contact for disinfection of not only the mycelia but of the spores involved as well. So products that are good to control powdery mildew: Regalia CG, sulfur, microbial inoculums like Bacillus species, Stargus, double nickel, cease, peracetic acids like xylitol and jet egg, as well as millstop. One of the more devastating diseases that we come in not only outside hemp but also indoor in the greenhouses is Botrytis cinerea, or also known as bud rot. Now, you've spent all this money and all this time to grow a product, and then at the very end, the last 2 weeks before you harvest, you can get this. And this comes about mainly because there is moisture in the buds, and that moisture leads to rot, and that fungus can take hold in those moisture wet flowers and then rot out your bud, making it useless for commercial or for to sell on the market. Good products to use here, again, Regalia CG will help prevent that. Peracetic acids like xylitol and jet egg. Stargus has been a very good product that we've seen to reduce bud rot, as well as Botrytis and actinovate. This is more of a hemp disease, so southern hemp blight, or Sclerotium ralphii. This is a very aggressive fungus, and it's usually in sort of like late, mid to late veg, and then early to mid flower is usually when we'll see this. And it's very associated, or it's very much associated with high humidity high humidity, rains, that sort of thing. But also if your soil already has some kind of inoculum of this fungus. And if you look on the left-hand side is just an overall picture of what southern hemp blight looks like. You'll have this white stem with a rot and more of a gray to blackish stem rot to it. And on the right hand, the two right-hand pictures, you see this sort of fan-like mycelia and these round resting structures called sclerotia. And if you've grown other crops in that soil before that have Sclerotium ralphii, those sclerotia can live, I believe, up to about 5 years in that soil. So if you do already have, sort of established inoculum source with Sclerotium ralphii, it's definitely something to think about as some preventive applications of some products. And those products would be the Bacillus species work pretty well on that, Stargus, double nickel, Armory, and some of these other sort of root inoculants, so Root Shield or TerraGrow, which include Trichodermis and Streptomyces. Regalia CG can help prevent that as well. And then peracetic acids are great to come in to basically sterilize as a kind of what we call a springe. So you're just basically just dousing that lower stem area and root zone. Verticillium rot, we see this, I would say more so on the West Coast than the East Coast, but so if you're growing crops that have verticillium, we have a lot of mint that we grow out here as well, which is notorious for verticillium root rot and stem rot. The hemp plants and cannabis plants are also susceptible to this fungus. And some of the same products that we talked about work very well on this root and stem rot, like Regalia CG, the microbial inoculums such as the Bacillus species or the Trichoderma and Streptomyces. And then, of course, the peracetic acids are a real staple of fungicide control, or sorry, fungus control. And you're seeing sort of the same things pop up here because there's very few products that are used in the market that are efficacious and that we can legally approved to use on cannabis and CBD hemp. And everything I say here, by the way, as far as products goes, you have to make sure you check with your local state laws, state and county laws, in order to make sure that you can use those products on your crops as well. One of the diseases that we saw a lot of actually this year, as far as large CBD hemp acres grown outdoors across the United States, we saw this more on the sort of East Coast. I would say East Coast, Southeast, and the mid to upper Midwest is leaf spot. And this sort of this was, as a plant pathologist, I didn't realize that this was going to be have so much so quickly as far as inoculum and so much disease and pressure out there. But we had very high pressure right off the bat in our first large-scale acreage of growing hemp, and that's Cercospora, Septoria species, and Bipolaris. In fact, the Bipolaris is Bipolaris giganteum, so it is one of the largest spores out there that cause leaf spot. And so some of the products that we're using effectively to control this leaf spot pressure is Regalia CG, the Jet Ag, or the parasitic acids. Sulfur works really well. The biologicals do a great job as well, the double nickel cease and Stargus. And this, obviously, this needs to be a preventative basis. You can't, if you start seeing leaf spot, you can do a curative treatment, but you're really not going to, improve much of what you already see. Will leaf spots, decimate your plants and reduce your yield? And the answer is yes, they can be. If untreated and you have high environmental conditions, the leaf spot can basically take out a bunch of your leaves and reduce your photosynthesis, thus reducing your yields. If you have a low amount of leaf spot, you may or may not need to treat it if your environment improves. So maybe it dries out, you have less rain or less humidity, it should be fine. But if you see those conditions consistent over time, then it's something you might want to treat for just to make sure your yields stay up. Now we're going to be focusing more on the insects that we see on cannabis and hemp. One of the major insects that we have right now are spider mites. You can see this in the greenhouse, indoor production, or even outdoor. So most of you are familiar with spider mites, and if you haven't, the top right picture is a couple of spider mites and an egg. And if you look on the bottom right is basically a nice large cannabis fan leaf, and you can see the spotting and the sort of the yellowing that happens to those leaves, and then of course the flowers that you see in the other pictures. When populations get very high, then those spider mites migrate to the top of the flower and start producing webbing, which then they can use to crawl around to other plants more effectively, but also as a place to rear their young even more. Some products that we're using right now really effectively to control spider mites. So Grandivo CG, Venerate CG, Impede, Azuractin products, Sufoil X, or some of these oils as you see out there. But Sufoil X is more of a brand name that a lot of people have been using across the country. But there's significantly other oils that you can use. Trilogy, so these are like neem oils. Pyganic, which is an organic pyrethrin. And then, of course, the beneficial insects, or BCAs. And so the BCAs that seem to work pretty well in spider mites, and these are going to be more used in the greenhouse situation versus outdoors, but we may see that show up in the outdoors as well. And these are Californicus, Andersoni, Fallacious species, and as well as the Phytocilius persimilis and the Spatilia Karasuga. Now, I apologize. As far as these genus species names go, they can be kind of a tongue twister. I'll say that. So, but these can be used quite effectively to manage populations, especially in late flower. So, as you're growing your cannabis or your CBD hemp, you want to most people reduce the amount of applications they do prior to harvest, maybe 2 to 4 weeks prior to harvest. And so if you're going into late flower, it's good to have some beneficial insects to help manage those populations right before harvest. The next one we see, and we see this more inside the greenhouses and indoor grow operations versus outside, and those are thrips. And you can see some of those thrips in the bottom right, what they look like. I believe so there's 3 or 4 little guys in there, and there's one small one at the top right, and I think that's an aphid, I believe that's what that is, but the other ones are thrips. And so some of that thrip damage that you see is those mouth parts are what we call raspers, and they sort of dig away the epidermal layer, and they leave little marks. So you can see in the bottom left-hand picture on that leaf, you see these little white spots on there. That's thrip damage, early thrip damage. The top right picture is where you see more of the yellowing spots, and that is more advanced thrip population. And what we really care about more so is if the thrips are in the flowers, because if they get into the flowers, they can cause stunting and deformation, and therefore in high enough numbers, they can really reduce your overall flower production. Products that work well are Grandivo CG, Venerate CG, Ampede, Azadirachtin, Stuff Oil X or other oils, Trilogy or other neem oils, Pyganic, which is an organic pyrethrin, and of course, beneficial insects or BCAs. And so the BCAs, if you want to write these down, if you're in an indoor operation, these are some of the ones to think about. So we've got Stratiolaps, Amblyceus cucumeris, Degenerans, Swirsky, and then of course we have a couple other ones like Aureus insidius, the Stenernema feltii, and Delocia beetles. This last slide here is more of what we see as far as overall genetic or abnormalities. So these are things that you may see in production in the outside world or even in your greenhouse. And these are not disease or insect related. So the picture on the right-hand side is we see this sort of stunted, extremely curled up leaves. That is, for right now, we believe that's just genetic, and the reason for that is you'll see only 1 or 2 of these plants per acre, so maybe one in 10,000 plants, and that's very indicative of a genetic abnormality. And the other 2 in the middle is what we see on the top one. We see it as yellowing, also referred as a chimera, and this is basically just another genetic abnormality with that plant where it doesn't produce photosynthesis or green pigment. And on the bottom one, you see a sort of excess leaf production. And if you ever see any of those 3, typically the picture on the right-hand side, which is very small and curled, if you see that, just rogue that plant and perhaps plant a new one in its place. The bottom picture in the middle, that's another plant that I would just basically rogue. You're not going to get much production out of that. But the chimera plants tend to grow out of it. So you can have a plant that basically will go to maturity and produce enough, a significant amount of CBD. And on the left-hand side picture is what hail damage does to hemp plants. So this is a picture of 200 acres that in southern Oregon, they had a hail come through, a nice hailstorm, and it basically defoliates all of the leaves off the stem. Now, for those who have been growing quite a bit now, as far as cannabis goes, you may know some of these growing techniques where you defoliate the plant, the cannabis plants, in a certain period of time in production, and that helps to generate actually more flower bud sites or larger flowers. But just so you know, is after that picture was taken, so that picture right before the hailstorm was right before the flower or the plant flipped into flower, where it's just starting to produce buds. So about 3 weeks after that picture was taken, the leaves came back onto the plant, and they actually got a decent, or relatively decent harvest of CBD hemp from those 200 acres. That brings me to sort of a midway point. Are there any questions thus far?
Yes, we actually have quite a few questions that have come in, and we'll see if we can deal with at least 3 or 4 of them right now, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end. But so I'll just go ahead with the first question, which is, we are a municipality in Ontario, Canada, and are these products available in Canada? And if not, is there a time frame for this registration?
That's a great question. I can't really speak to products that are not ours, just because of legal reasons. You're gonna have to check your local sort of product list that your Canadian municipality should have put out in some form. I will say this, that we have one product of ours that is registered in Canada, and that's Regalia, but it is a 20% solution. It's called Regalia Max. And so you just have to, basically dilute it down to what it says on the label to apply it to your cannabis plant.
Okay. All right, our next question is, what are you referring to when you say auto-flowering?
Okay, so an auto-flower. So typically, to grow cannabis or hemp, you require a certain vegetation period to grow the plant up, and then you need a certain light cycle in order to make it flower. So typically, during the summertime, we have very long days, 18 hours, 16 hours of light, 15 hours of light. But as we get farther past summer and we're getting to almost into fall, what happens is we get down to more of a 13 hours or 12 hours on 12 hours of darkness. And that point, what you see is the plant recognizes that the days are getting shorter, and it starts producing flowers because it anticipates that it needs to produce flowers, seed, and then eventually die in the wintertime. With auto flowers, that's not necessarily needed as far as a shorter day length in order to flip that plant into flower. So you could, with an auto flower, basically have a 15-hour day length, and then the rest is darkness, or a 16-hour day length, and the rest is darkness, or a 14-hour, 13-hour, day length, and the rest is darkness. It doesn't really matter. As long as the plant's growing, it'll automatically, genetically flip into flower when it's ready to. Some auto flowers that have been bred will automatically flip into flower in 65 days, or go from basically seed germination to finish of that flower in 65 days. Some are 70, some are 75, or 80 or 90 days. So the bottom line of this is, in the winter time, where we have very low amounts of, or a limited amount of sunlight, maybe 12 or 13 hours in the south of the United States, we can still grow hemp outdoors, and even cannabis for that matter, with those shorter day lengths with these auto flowers. So that helps to extend our production in the wintertime and not just the summertime. Okay.
That's a good explanation. Thank you. All right, our next question is, can I use Regalia with Regalia compost tea application?
The answer is yes. You can apply Regalia as mixed with a whole bunch of other products as well. So you can use compost teas, or you can use some other insecticides or biofungicides in the same tank. It's very compatible with other products. You can also do, not only can you do a foliar applications, but you can also do Regalia as a drench. So if you're mixing up a fertilizer and you're going to be, fertilizing your root zones, then you can actually put in Regalia as well, and that will help to strengthen the root system.
Okay. Okay, good. And I think we'll just do one last question and then move on to the next part of the presentation. And that's, are you recommending mixing Regalia with a PAA?
Yes, that is able. You are able to mix those two together. Yes. Okay.
All right, good. I think we'll move on to our next speaker then in our next section. So I would like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Timothy Johnson.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Johnson with Marrone Bioinnovations, and I'm, as previously mentioned, Vice President of Field Development and Technical Service. So my training is as an entomologist, so I'll give Matt a little bit of a break on his pronunciations. He's a plant pathologist, and I think he alluded that mites might even be insects, but we make a pretty good combination as a pathologist and as an entomologist. So. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the products that Matt introduced to the audience and talk a little bit more about some of the other applications and other CG segments and show a little bit of some of the data that we've been generating on cannabis and hemp. So we'll move to the next slide and talk just briefly about the products that Matt introduced at the beginning of the presentation. And some of the questions have already alluded to some of the characteristics of these products. And we'll start with Regalia CG. So Regalia is a plant extract from Reynoutria sachalinensis, and the most important thing about this product is that its mode of action is that it triggers plant defense mechanisms. And that means that the product itself does not have direct activity on the fungal disease organism. Therefore, you have to use the product in a very preventative measure because you're triggering the plant to produce the defensive compounds. Sometimes that's called an ISR or an SAR response, depending on the genetic pathway that's triggered. We see evidence in Regalia that both are triggered, so it's a little bit of a moot point. The other interesting aspect about Regalia is that we do see a plant health effect, and that's because we see an increase in leaf chlorophyll content. As Matt mentioned earlier, for powdery mildew control, that's one of the chief uses for Regalia. That's a disease that it's particularly strong on, whether it be cannabis, hemp, or a variety of other different diseases. Botrytis is pretty good on, but it's not particularly strong, for example, on the white mold complex. It is registered in the U.S., has been for quite some time, and this is the product that Matt mentioned that is registered in Canada as Regalia Max. It's a 20% formulation, whereas in the U.S. we have a 5%. And the label in Canada is specifically for greenhouse cannabis for suppression of powdery mildew and I believe also botrytis. Just a quick photo looking at an example of the plant health benefit. This is separate from disease control. This happens to be an outdoor crop of peanuts, but it's a nice photo. Basically, the grower's fungicide program, he also added Regalia, which isn't particularly active on any of the diseases that are in peanuts, but it shows that we got more rapid row closure where the Regalia was used, purely plant health benefit. Of course, there's other segments to the CG or cultivated garden segment outside of cannabis and hemp, and that would include things such as ornamentals and indoor vegetable production. Regalia is often used for control of powdery mildew in the floriculture industry. This is a photograph of Gerber daisies, a pretty good example. But again, to stress, it's all about good scouting and IPM practices. You have to use Regalia really before the disease is present, and you use it in a preventative manner. If you see an infestation that looks like it's a little bit spreading or so forth, that's where you can come in with sort of a knockdown material, whether it be a PAA or a product such as Impede or something along that line that has a direct eradicative type activity. Moving to Stargus, which is another fungicide, but it's very different. It's a very different mode of action. It's bacillus-based. It's the fermentation process that produces lipopeptides that are themselves directly active on certain disease organisms. There are a number of different bacillus fungicides on the market, and they're all unique. They're definitely not all just one and the same. They all have strengths and weaknesses on different diseases, so you really need to take a close look at the label to make sure that the one you are thinking of using is truly labeled for the disease you want to control. In the Stargus situation, it's a product that is Not particularly strong on powdery mildew. We have Regalia for that use. But it is quite good on some of the oomycete soil-borne diseases as well as botrytis and downy mildew. Also happens to be quite good on white mold. And that was one of the diseases that sort of surprised us this summer in hemp production in the Southeast, which happens to be where I reside. Kind of a brave new world out there this year. We didn't know what would show up, and we definitely had some surprises, and that was one of them. Might action that for Regalia, that the FRAC code is P5. For Stargus, we don't yet have our FRAC code, but we should have that fairly soon. Just a quick example of a lab study with Petri dishes where we inoculate with a disease organism. One is untreated and one we have Stargus, and you can see the effect of the Stargus in terms of not allowing that disease to spread. That's the one on the right. Just an example of the lipopeptides themselves being directly active on the disease organism. If that were Regalia, both of the Petri dishes would look like the one on the left because Regalia requires plant tissue to function. JetAg, as Matt has mentioned, is a good multi-purpose sanitizer, so it's a good product to have to maybe kind of clean the crop before you come in with a bacillus product or Regalia as preventative type measure. It can also be kind of a good rescue treatment. Mode of action-wise, it basically denatures the enzymes and proteins in single-cell organisms. So it's pretty broadly active on a number of different fungal and bacterial diseases. But the rates do vary depending on what you're trying to target. So you do have to take a close look at the label to make sure that you're using the proper concentration to control the disease that you're trying to get rid of. Talk a little bit about insecticides. This is the part that tends to interest me the most as an entomologist. We have both Venerate and Grandivo. They have pretty similar target species that they're going after, but they're very different in terms of their mode of action and how they're used. Venerate is a liquid formulation. Typical use rate for the label is 1 to 4 quarts per 100 gallons. Probably in commercial use, 2 quarts would be most active. It has a 4-hour reentry interval, which is quite good, 0 days to harvest, and it's exempt from residues. Basically, for the most part, what we're seeing in this market segment is we're going after thrips, whiteflies, 2-spotted spider mites. It does have activity on some of the Lepidoptera pests that we're seeing crop up, such as corn earworm and field hemp. But otherwise, in the indoor production, it's the usual sort of cast of characters that we always seem to be trying to control. Mode of action-wise, we see interference with molting. We see activity against both adult and immature sucking insects through exoskeleton degradation, and it seems to interfere with the molting process. If it is a certain beetle species or Lepidoptera that's susceptible to Venerate and they ingest it, it acts as a stomach poison, sort of in a manner like a BT product does. You get a pretty rapid cessation of feeding, but it may take 4 days or more for the target pest to actually die. Grandivo, on the other hand, is a water dispersible granule. So this can be quite a difference if you're using like a dosatron or fogging type equipment in a greenhouse. In that situation, Venerate's a much better product for that application than is Grandivo. In this case, it's a water dispersible granule. A lot of the same target pests that we're going after, but it'll have a little bit different mode of action that I'll talk about. 1 to 3 pounds per 100 gallons, 2-pound rate being most common. But again, as with most biologicals, the same as Regalia, Stargus, and Venerate, 4-hour reentry, 0 days to harvest, but exempt from residues. And that's why we see these products being allowed and probably labeled quite quickly by EPA, for example, for hemp production. It's all about the residues. So for Grandivo, we see some very interesting agitation and repellency early on after application. Upon ingestion, we see gut disruption. For the sucking pests and mites, we see a reduction in egg laying, egg hatching, and fecundity. And like Venerate, we see a very rapid cessation in feeding for things such as aphids and psyllids and spider mites. Again, though, it is a fairly slow-acting product, and it can easily take 4 to 7 days to see the full use of the full activity on the population itself, because the insects may hang around, they simply don't necessarily die right away. Important thing to remember in all these crop segments, of course, is scouting and understanding what your product can do in terms of its mode of action. This just happens to be an example of powdery mildew on cucumber. either of those photos is basically a train wreck. You're way too late really to start at that point. The one on the left, you might be able to come in with a impede or PAA, clean it up a bit, but really you want to be preventative. And if you start to see any colonies at all, you need to adjust your program to make sure you get it back under control. Downy mildew, of course, is even more aggressive than powdery mildew. Downy can be extremely problematic in the cucurbits, whether it be field or greenhouse. Definitely a more difficult insect or a more pathogen to control. Usually requires a closer application interval and attention to detail because this is a very aggressive disease. Angular leaf spot, which is caused by a bacterial disease, it's worth noting that most of the ISR and SAR type products do have activity to help suppress bacterial diseases. So this is a situation where you have to be very conscientious about which product that you're using. Sanitation can be extremely important in this case so that employees are not spreading the disease in a greenhouse situation, but it can be pretty difficult. But a combination of the ISR, SAR type products along with the sterilants such as PAA can usually make this disease manageable. And then of course in tomato production or the other solanaceous plants, we have the typical duo of early blight, late blight. Again, it's all about attention to detail and sanitation of the greenhouse, making sure that it never really gets going. And white mold, as both Matt and I mentioned earlier, that's one that definitely popped up in the southeastern U.S. this year. We saw a lot of it in southern Virginia and eastern North Carolina. Definitely takes a multi-pronged approach. And I think the reason we saw so much this year is because of some of the crops that have been growing in that part of the country earlier. White mold also infects tobacco and peanuts, and these are crops that had probably been grown on the land earlier in which the hemp was planted. And I think that's why it became quite a bit of a problem. Hopefully next year the growers will be looking forward a little bit more proactively and can do a good job of managing it and or rotating to other locations. Let's just look a little bit at some efficacy data. It's been a very interesting crop to work with, hemp and cannabis, just because of the legalities and so forth, and trying to find people that are well equipped to conduct quality studies. We've been working up in Canada for several years. It's been a little bit easier environment to work on. This happens to be a greenhouse cannabis, looking at two rates of Grandivo CG, 4 and 8 grams per liter, and Venerate CG, the liquid, 8 and 12 milliliters per liter. And in this case, you know, on a 7-day type schedule, we're looking at 7 and 14 days after the 4th application, we're getting a very high level of control for two-spotted spider mite. And it's all about scouting and early application. You know, these are not rescue products. You've got to be on top of it quickly. And if it does get a little bit out of hand, there are some alternatives that can help bring those numbers back under control. This is an example of, this happens to be root mealybug. This is on an ornamental plant, sedum. And of course, root aphids are a big problem in indoor hemp and cannabis production. It's been a difficult pest to find a scenario in which products can be evaluated. We have had this trial recently completed by Stanton Gill at the University of Maryland. This is a drench application. 3 drenches on a 7-day interval for both the Venerate CG and the Grandivo CG, and both products did a very nice job of eradicating a root mealybug infestation. So we're hopeful that we'll also see this on root aphids. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence from growers that they use these products for that purpose, but we've had a challenging time generating good data to help us with our proper use patterns. This slide is the last data slide. It happens to show an interesting dose response between Regalia at the 2 quart per 100 gallon rate versus the 4 quart. So in this case, the purple bar happens to be powdery mildew incidence, and the lower bar is better. So it does show that there's quite a rate response in this situation. The lighter blue bar is bud rot or botrytis incidence, or actually it happens to be white mold bud rot in this case, and it shows how it's a more difficult disease for Regalia to control even at the higher rate. So this is a good example of where for powdery mildew, Regalia is the product of choice, but for the white mold, it probably would have been better to have gone with the Stargus. A lot of growers, as Matt mentioned earlier, are using biocontrol agents and beneficials as part of the program. So it's important that we know about compatibility. So we've done quite a bit of work looking at the effects of our products on about a dozen commonly used biocontrol agents of various types. And we're continuing this work. In fact, we are just recently starting a new study with the Vineland Institute up in Ontario, looking at more longer term to see if there's any chronic effects on some of these commonly used pests or biocontrol agents. We're optimistic we won't see any because from an acute point of view, we have a very good compatibility with them, and that's the way we want to keep it. We do have a good team out in the field ready to help growers and answer questions. Matt leads the CG sector, and then I myself have 4 people out in the field that provide technical assistance. So we have a good commercial group that's out there ready to help growers with their problems. It's always important to recognize the trademarks of other companies' products that we've mentioned in today's presentation. We've tried to be very open about the broad range of products that are out there to help growers with their various production challenges, because there certainly are plenty of them. And with that, we'll move to any more questions that people might have. I suspect there are going to be several.
Yes, you are right. We have been flooded with questions. So there's, and these questions can go to either one of you who wish to answer them. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Are there any controls for root aphids? Is the first question. And
well,
I'm assuming that means on cannabis, but I'm not entirely sure. They didn't specify.
Yeah, and I suspect that question probably came in before I got to the root mealybug slide. So, anecdotally, we definitely know we have people that are using both Grandivo and Venerate as drenches for control of root aphid. It's been a challenge for me to find a good researcher that has populations you can get good data on. We see good efficacy on root mealybug, so we think both of these products will have utility for root aphid, but I'd like to get some good research done so that we can get the proper timing down, focusing on the rates, how many applications, and so forth. And I really don't see any other products that have a good potential for that application that are readily available right now.
Okay. And I'm just going to say, I know we're very close to our 1 hour mark. We have so many questions, and we're going to extend the webinar a little bit longer. But if you do need to go, you're free to go. But we seem to have so much interest, we wanted to at least get some of these questions addressed.
Can I just chime in? I just want to chime in real quick about the root aphids. As Tim mentioned, there's few products out there that are available for different insects as far as good research backing. But there are growers who have used a couple other products besides ours as a drench. Be it labeled or not labeled, or in their state, you have to make sure you use products that obviously are allowed. But having said that, Pyganic, which is the organic pyrethrin, coupled with products like PFR97, Botanicard, the WP version, and I'm trying to think of something else. Those are the main ones right now that we're having decent efficacy to control root aphids. Root aphids is another thing. Is like once you get root aphids into your indoor operation, they're very hard to get rid of, and so this is kind of one of the worst insects to get. And if you do get them, you're going to be in flower. You're going to be just basically you're managing them. And if you can eliminate them early on, that's where you want to start, is to have a really clean, not only root zone, then the transplants themselves, and then the room itself needs to be disinfected in all kinds of ways to prevent any new outbreaks from happening. Okay.
All right. We will go on to the next question, which is any comments on white mold, the Sclerotinia sclerodiorum, on control with contans or biocontrol with, pardon if I mispronounced, Coniotherium minitans? Are either of you able to answer that question?
Tim?
I have a little bit of experience with contans. It absolutely could be used for white mold control. I actually just, happen to be friends with the guy who's worked with it for a long time with the company that produces it, and It's been used reasonably widely in bean production, soybean and dried bean production in the upper Midwest. The key is you typically apply it in the fall of the year prior to your crop year. So it has sort of a unique application methodology.
Okay, and the second part of his question about the biocontrol with Coniotherium minitans, are you, either of you familiar with that?
The name rings a bell, but I'm not familiar enough that I feel comfortable answering.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, the next question is Regalia photosensitive. For instance, can I spray under 1,000 watt HPS grow lights?
Yes.
Nice, simple answer.
Yeah, very simple. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And let's see. With Grandivo and Venerate, are we counting on predominantly contact activity or is ingestion necessary?
That's one of the great mysteries of the universe. It depends a lot on the pest species. And the circumstantial evidence seems to indicate that we're getting some level of translaminar activity through which the sucking pests ingest it. If it's a chewing pest like a caterpillar or a leaf-eating beetle, they are obviously ingesting it.
Okay. Do you have any experience with Beauveria bassiana and Metarhizium for leaf and soil pests?
Matt, do you have any experience with those? I mean, these certainly are a number of products that have been on the market for a long time, but I don't have any personal experience with them in this market segment.
Yes, I mean, so foliarly you can use them for different some insect control, but typically what I found for, if I'm just speaking just specifically for cannabis, I think that's where our majority of our audience is. What we see for Beauveria bassiana is more of a root drench, and again, that's more designed for some root issues, specifically root aphids. But we do see Beauveria bassiana being used foliar applications as well. The biggest product that's being used on the market that most people are familiar with is Botanigard, but there are some others as well, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. We'll follow up with here. In hemp, can calcium polysulfide and Pythium-dated, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that right, Pythium-dated copper sulfate be used? Are you familiar with those products?
I am not.
All right. That might be something that can be followed up on a little later.
Yeah, maybe we can follow up with that. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Are you not afraid of resistance with multiple Grandivo applications if applied every 7 days for mite control?
Well, it's really a good reason to potentially rotate Grandivo and Venerate. Both of these products have multiple active compounds that are involved with the activity that we think should reduce the likelihood of resistance developing, but you should never assume that. Evolution is a very powerful phenomenon, so it's always good to practice good resistance management practices.
Okay. Are Venerate and Grandivo systemic or locally systemic, or both?
Well, they're definitely not systemic. For example,
Okay.
if you apply them foliarly, you won't see them in the roots, or vice versa. Ironically, if you inject Venerate into a tree, you do get systemic movement up into the branches and so forth. We've been doing some work with orchard crops. We do seem to have some translaminar activity though into the foliage.
Okay. All right. Here's one. Are the products mentioned today labeled for use on cannabis, either via ambiguous label language or specifically stating cannabis?
Matt, you want to talk about that with the different states and how they're handling it? I think you're more familiar with that than I am.
Yeah, you and I have worked on this this past year a lot, and this is the biggest question that we get as a company, and most of the companies out there, is that what are the allowed to be on cannabis or hemp? Are they registered? What do these labels look like? Do they have cannabis on the label? So right now, federally, speaking, cannabis, as far as high THC product, is federally illegal. And in that sense, no labels right now can have the language, the word cannabis on it, on the label, if I understand it correctly in the United States. But hemp is now, they're now allowing the word hemp to be on there. So that opens up products to be used on cannabis species. So we are going to see products, labels going forward, maybe at the end of this year, maybe throughout next year, as more and more products are going to be approved for cannabis and hemp, specifically hemp. You'll see the word hemp on the label because of, obviously, if you've got that much acreage out there, chemical companies obviously want to get their products approved for use on hemp. That's it seems to be obviously pretty good dollars. So the answer is yes for hemp, but no, that you won't see the term cannabis on it, which is kind of confusing, as I know that for sure.
Yeah, okay. And I know that things are going to be continue to be sorted out as time goes on with that.
Yeah,
question.
and also just want to say that so the Western states have been doing this for a while now. So there's more products available on lists that are approved for use on cannabis and hemp in those states. Now, as the other states, let's say the southeastern states or the Northwest, Northeast, typically right now for hemp production, there is very limited, if any, products that are listed by that state. Some states have a list of approved products. Some states do not. Many of the northeastern states and the states surrounding sort of the eastern side and some others around the country list what we call 25B products. And so 25B products are EPA exempt products. So these are like soaps and oils. So they have very little or low toxicity, if any toxicity, to humans or insects and birds or whatever around them. And so those are basically what we say exempt from EPA. And so those products essentially are allowed to be used in hemp production and that, for that matter, cannabis production in those early medical and recreational states.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to ask one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up the webinar. But how, if at all, does knotweed's invasive status impact your use of it for Regalia production?
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I was actually at a entomological society meeting 2 weeks ago, and there was a presentation on efforts in Oregon to use insects to eradicate invasive knotweed species in the U.S. And I'm like, no. Well, we actually source our extract from outside the U.S. And we have looked at producing it in the U.S., but the fact that it is an invasive plant would make that pretty problematic. So it does not impact us, is the bottom line.
Okay. Well, that's great. All right. I think we're going to have to wrap up the webinar. And if you did not get your question answered today, and I know there were a few of you, the folks at Marrone will do their best to get back to you with answers. We have your email and what question you asked. So I want to thank you so much for attending today. And as a reminder, an on-demand version of this webinar will be archived in the next couple of hours. And it will be available at the same link you used to get on this webinar today, which is the same as the registration link that you had. You can also find the link at growingproduce.com/webinars. So thank you all for joining us today, and especially thank you to our two speakers and to Marrone Bio Innovations for making the webinar possible. Have a good day.